But we can change that. We can change that with something pretty simple. You do not need an app for this. You do not need a credit card. You do not need an 800 number. What you need is a conversation.
A conversation.
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 The conversation, an exchange between great minds.
Hi guys, this is episode 10 of The Conversation. Today, Mark and I, we talk about our favorite presidents. Let's get right into it. Awesome. So, hi guys today. This is Miles, of course, and we're going to present our top 5 presidents, Mark and I. So what we're going to do is we're going to say I'm going to say my top 5, my fifth favorite president. Then Mark's going to go for his fifth. So I'll start it off with my own list. So for me, for number 5, I have JFK. So JFK is, of course, I think a very classic, good American president. He's an extremely popular figure, very charismatic, very young person. And, I think he had his, low points. I don't think it was great that he lowered taxes necessarily for the top marginal tax rate. But at the same time, he was really an amazing leader. He drove us through the Cuban Missile Crisis that could have really ended in utter disaster. He also created the Peace Corps, and I think he did his best to try to advance civil rights in America. So although I think he wasn't, he didn't last that long as a president. He was only there for 2 years. He was still, I think, instrumental in creating certain changes in America. What do you think, Mark? What's your number 5?
Yeah, I think that's a good choice, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I'm going to go in a bit of a different direction. Might be attributed to recency bias, or simply because I kind of have a man crush on this guy. But my number 5 is Obama. I think there isn't too much to be explained here because he was a recent president, but I was a huge fan of the ACA. Stimulus economy through the recession years that helped with the booming economy, I think was really obviously instrumental in bringing back the unemployment rate and bringing things back to normal. And honestly, coming out of his presidency, we were in a really good position up until the coronavirus kind of brought things spiraling downhill. But his economic reform was really important. And then obviously you have to remember that he was a Nobel Peace Prize recipient in 2009. Although, just to be clear, that I'm not really entirely sure what that was for. It was 2009, year into Obama's great, and the reasons he won it for were valid, and I think he was an advocate of human rights issues. But I think it might have been a bit premature to give that to him in his first year of his presidency. And then smaller things as well, like closing Guantanamo, implementing the don't ask, don't tell policies in the military, formally ending the Iraq War, overseeing the assassination of bin Laden. Were just small little things that kind of add up. And there are things that I admire in a president who was also really charismatic, kind of like JFK. So I think there's kind of parallels between the two.
Yeah,
kind of interesting.
I totally agree with that. I love that. It's really funny that we have these kind of
presidents who are really charismatic and pioneers. Because you have JFK, totally. who was the first Catholic president, and that's groundbreaking at the time. And then you have Barack Obama, who's the first African American, even though he's biracial, but the first African American, and a name. Let's face it, Barack Obama. It's a Kenyan name. I think that's really different from any kind of name that we've had in the past. So I think
I love that.
Obama was a real pioneer.
Mark, what I also love about that is that kind of such a great idea about parallelism. But I also think to add on to that, this idea of being young, this young president, they were both very symbolically representing of change. And
absolutely.
I think great number 5 picks. So number 4 for me is an oldie but a goodie, Thomas Jefferson. So I think Thomas Jefferson is a pretty good president. He's really great. I think he's generally overlooked by the other presidents of his era. So George Washington, of course, and everybody loves George Washington. How can you not love George Washington? And unfortunately, it's on my list, but that's not the point. And, for example, also John Adams. But I think Thomas Jefferson he's really important. Of course, he wrote the Declaration of Independence, which was groundbreaking work. But I think as a person, he was very symbolic of the change that was happening in America. He was a classic liberalist. I don't know if that's a word. Liberalism, of course, right?
Sure,
He loved democracy. Yeah, exactly. He wanted. He really loved the French Revolution. Having all these ideas of liberty, kind of.
he was also a champion.
Yeah, bubbling up. Champion of the people. Democracy, exactly.
Yeah.
But in terms of policy stuff, I think the Lewis and Clark expedition buying the Louisiana Purchase, amazing. Like, I mean, in terms of the greatest history of trade deals and the history of trade deals, definitely this is one of the trade deals that were the best in the history of trade deals. I think also he was overall a president that was very good, that was very stable. I think he had, the embargo was obviously not that great, but he was just overall, I think a good president.
So that's an interesting pick, Miles. I agree with a lot of what you said there. I think he absolutely fleeced Napoleon, like, completely. That was the deal of the century. I mean, we just got it for money.
Yeah.
It was a good trade. I completely agree with you on that one. Although I left Jefferson out of my top 5, and we'll get into this in a little bit about our disagreements. I went a little bit of a different direction again. I went with Dwight Eisenhower, and I know he's in your top. We'll talk about him a little bit later. I'll give a little bit of a rundown about why I have him. Also, interesting, Miles, that we've had 4 different presidents named so far. So I'm wondering maybe if our top 3 are going to be pretty similar, but we'll get into it. Anyway, Eisenhower's reasons I took him. He's a safe candidate for me. He did a lot of good stuff. He didn't do a lot of massive policy goals, and I don't really think it was needed at that time because the economy was rolling. We're coming out of Second World War with relatively little damage, at least compared to their European counterparts. So Eisenhower for me is a really safe candidate because he didn't have to do too much. That being said, he did a lot. He was one of the original politicians to warn of the military-industrial complex. I know you, as a Bernie guy, Miles, you're probably a big fan of that one.
Of course.
He's a Republican. He was a Republican, I think.
Yeah.
Totally. That's the thing. He pulled out of the Korean War. Big one there. It was kind of. I mean, I think he ran on that really, because that was a unpopular war. I think Americans are sick and tired of war. Everyone is. No one likes war. So I'm happy with him for that. Getting out of the Korean War, expanding Social Security by adding 10 million Americans to the program. I mean, honestly, I think that's probably the biggest thing he did for the American people was expanding Social Security, setting a historical precedent there, and where the government is intervening in the lives of private American citizens and really bettering day-to-day life, which I think is really important that he intervened in that respect. What else did he do? He helped discredit Joe McCarthy behind the scenes, apparently. I don't really know too much about this. I saw this online.
Exactly. So, let's just go to number 3 because I actually also have Eisenhower on my list.
I don't want to ramble too much. I'll
Don't worry. That's okay. But for number 3, I don't have Eisenhower yet, but I do have Teddy Roosevelt.
You do
now,
have Teddy.
I do have him. Now, I really love, I think he's just a good president. In terms of policy, a one-term president, of course, but he was very good. Creation of national parks, national monuments. I think that's amazing. How can you, also the National Forestry Program? Like, how could you not like that, right? That's something that we all enjoy now. Like, we're all imagining us being in nature, like once this quarantine's over, like being able to go to our national parks, and he's really to thank for part of that. And although I think he did have his own problems himself with, I think colonialist problems, right? The big stick approach. In terms of domestic policy, he was really great. I mean, also I think he created the FDA. He also was known for creating other progressive programs. I mean, he was he was a true progressive, right? He even created his party, of course, the Bull Moose Party. And I think he was just, as a progressive, as a Bernie guy, he's really a president, I think, that did a lot of change to America, for the better.
Yeah, I agree with that. As I think the Roosevelts are a pretty powerful family. They still are, actually.
Yep.
Really, really cool president. Although I left him out of my top 10, Miles. I did. Or actually, well, top 5. He might be towards. I didn't really figure out my top 10, but he's cool. I like the Federal Park Service. That's awesome. But he's just not my top 10. Anyway, also another thing, Miles, we've had different presidents for each. Still, really interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get into your third. Let's get into your third, Mark.
I'm gonna continue that trend. My third president I put was Madison, James Madison. Why? Well, because I thought Jefferson made a couple mistakes. He was the president who preceded Madison, and Madison kind of had to get us out of that hot mess. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. I don't know how much time we have. I've been rambling a little bit, so I'm gonna go on. I'm gonna talk about Madison a bit more when I argue with you about Jefferson. But just things that Madison did that I liked. Getting us kind of out of the mess that Jefferson did in terms of the trade wars that were kind of starting to develop with Europe, and just some writing Federalist Papers. We'll get into that. But anyway, number 3
of course.
is Madison.
Awesome. Okay, so for my number 2, I went with Eisenhower. So Mark went with Eisenhower before. So the reason I like Eisenhower is, he's this Republican, of course, but he was really a progressive. And so we obviously mentioned all of his policy platforms. Also, was pretty cool. He created the Health Education Welfare Department. He also increased the minimum wage. Again, more examples of really, I think, progressive policies. Also, one thing that was really interesting that I actually learned from this book. So this book I'm reading called Sea Power. I didn't love the book personally, but that's not the point. One cool thing was that apparently he was avidly against the Vietnam War, because strategically, as a general, of course, he was like, this is not a good idea to get in it. And I think it's very cool, because it's I really didn't know that, and I think that's kind of admirable to for a U.S. president not to engage in conquering other countries. Yay! How amazing! So. I think he's good. For all the reasons you said.
It's interesting that we mentioned that Eisenhower is a Republican, because he was, but a lot of the reform that he had was kind of traditionally associated with more democratic reform, or at least what we call Democrats today. Raising marginal tax rates for the top 1%, and just doing a bunch of social security reform, and there's a lot of things that Eisenhower did that I don't really traditionally associate with Republican platform. That's a little bit besides the point. That was your number 2, right?
Yep.
Good. They're pretty high on Ike. Cool. I have my number 2 is FDR. I know he's going to be in your list. I'm predicting it right now. I know you love FDR. I don't want to talk too much about him, because I know you're going to want to give the whole spiel on FDR. But to keep it short, I love the New Deal. International relations was a platform that he was really successful in, and I'm sure you're going to get into that. But FDR did a lot of things right. He also did a lot of things wrong. But we're going to talk about that in our second segment, or second part of this segment.
Sure. Okay, so of course, what a surprise, FDR number 1. And so I think the reason for this is really, as Mark said, that I like Bernie, and the reason for besides the point is that the reason that I like Bernie Sanders is because of his economic policies. It's social stuff is cool, but I love his economic policies. And the reason I think that's an important fact to talk about is that FDR was very known for this. FDR was all about the grand sweeping economic platforms that employed millions of Americans, and this was really huge stuff. Of course, the New Deal number 1, New Deal number 2. So, for example, it included the Social Security Board, Securities and Exchange Commission, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, created the Tennessee Valley Authority, which of course enabled the government to build dams and such. He also established the Works Progress Administration, Permanent Jobs Program. Also, of course, again, the Social Security Act, it keeps going on and on and on. And the stuff that he did is, I think, really commendable as a president. Too often, we don't think of the workers, the people that, do everything in this country. And I think FDR, especially in a time of it was a crisis, right? It was the Great Depression. He managed to steer America out of that, especially like following Herbert Hoover, who was a terrible president. He arguably like made it so much worse. And FDR was like, okay, government isn't that bad, and let's just he went with the whole Keynesian approach, which I also personally agree with so much.
Yeah.
So I think for all those reasons, he was really a great leader.
Yeah, it's hard to disagree with you on any of that, Miles. There's so many of those reforms are still so important to American society today. But I put him at number 2, and I'll explain why in a little bit. My number 1 was, surprise, surprise, Abraham Lincoln. I know, really shocker. A lot of people put Lincoln. He's one of the most.
Wait, Mark. Before we go on anymore, though,
yeah.
I realized that we don't have George Washington on any of our lists.
Well, you know what? He's not
insane.
It's surprising. I'll give you that. But he's not in my top 5. And he's cool, right? He was he was a general that people liked, but he wasn't a good general, right? That's been established. Yeah. And as a president, he kind of relied on the dudes around him a little bit. And he wasn't that interested in being the president. He didn't show that fire.
Oh yeah, that's true. But I think he's just a very popular pick. But yeah, that's kind of cool.
We're not people to follow others, though. I don't know. I didn't say that properly. We we have our own lists here, Miles. We're not gonna.
Totally. Yeah, we're free thinking individuals.
Basic. That's too basic. Anyway, Lincoln. I think it's pretty self-explanatory why he's on here. Emancipation of the slaves. That's a big one. Also, just managing the economy while we're going through a tumultuous period in American history. Finding a way to not have the South secede from the Union, pushing the United States through a time of industrialization, not making the economy go broke. And honestly, even though he wasn't able to accomplish everything that he wanted to, especially being assassinated in his second term, he was pretty instrumental in Reconstruction behind the scenes, because he was able to maintain a lot of the structures that were important to the Union in the first place. So I think Lincoln did a really nice job. I was kind of tempted to slide him a bit, but just the prestige that is attached with his name and all the important legislation that he got passed is it's really difficult to overlook and not put him at number 1, because he's such a symbolic and important president for the United States.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think he may have should have been on my top 5. I don't know. Whatever. Great ideas, I think. So I think we should go in right now to a couple of disagreements or reasons, I guess, kind of more comparative look at these lists. And I would like to address Obama first.
Okay.
So I think I have a couple of reasons why you didn't pick some presidents in my list, but I think for me Obama is this. I think he's great. I think he's a solid pick, but at the same time, I think we have kind of this this vision of Obama that is like say like an ideal vision of Obama that isn't really the reality of the situation. I think it's just because we have Trump right now and he's so terrible that at the same time we look at Obama and he's like, okay, he's the best. And the reason I say that is because, of course, under Obama, you had drone strikes, you had, we were still allied to Saudi Arabia, foreign policy was terrible. And also the dealing with the 2008 financial crisis was also, I think, problematic. Also repealing Glass-Steagall, plenty of policy decisions that were very, very bad. I mean, basically, the big banks giving all of this, having terrible practices and then coming out of it on top of the economy, getting more money is I think terrible.
Well, Miles, the problem is that you can make different arguments. I know you're against corporate bailouts, but the thing is, they're kind of the backbone of our economy, and they're what's made us so strong in the first place. The thing is, when it comes down to it, you can argue about the nitty-gritty details, and I agree that there are some policy decisions that Obama made that I don't particularly agree with. But if you look at things big picture, the creation of the ACA was a groundbreaking achievement, reuniting both the left and the right to come up with a healthcare plan, even though some can argue that it's already kind of outdated. It's historically a huge achievement. And then also, Miles, I know you don't like the corporate bailout, but he still implemented a stimulus economy. And we're still at the point in 2016, 2017 where we've regained our place, and we never really lost it, but we're in an extremely powerful economy at that point.
Yeah,
And
sure, I understand, but I think my main disagreement with the bailouts is that it used already. I think something like from trickled up economics works, I think, way more. That's the first thing. Second thing, I think he kind of he's part of this kind of era of Reaganite Democrats, or not Reaganite. What am I talking about? Democrats in the footsteps of Reagan. Of course, he's more left than Reagan. But what I'm saying is that there's this idea that trickled down economics, Reaganomics is the way to go, and that's the main idea behind the bailouts, right? Giving money to consumers is obviously the way to go. So, although I think we should, move on. I think we should move on because this is not a podcast about Obama, but about presidents.
Okay, I'm just gonna give the last tidbit though.
Okay, sure, and then we'll move on to another person.
I think it's still up for grabs. We don't necessarily know whether or not giving money to corporations or to consumers is the right way to go, because you'll see now, for example, with stimulus checks, a lot of the money that people are receiving is not going into buying consumer goods. That's not lifting the economy. It's going into basic food staples and maybe into retirement funds or people have other specific needs. Whereas in the financial crisis, that money needed to be going into businesses so you can lift the economy so that they can continue to people. And that's what ultimately brought the unemployment rate down. Anyway, that's besides the point. We can argue about little things about Obama. I love him. I have a man crush on him. I've explained that. You might not necessarily agree with his policies as a further person who's a bit further left than I am. That's all right. Now my turn to disagree with something that you said. I have Jefferson out completely of my top 10. And here's and you know what? His entire vision, Miles, was built upon agriculture. It's kind of big. That's true. Of the people, which I know something that you're pretty fond of, but he was really big into sponsoring the individual, and that to me is kind of against the ideas that we adopted throughout the 19th century. Now, that's fine on a smaller scale, but the problem is that we started adopting industrialism and the modernization of our industry pretty much right after Jefferson left his presidency, and that is the instrumental thing. That is the one thing that made us the superpower that we are today. Is because as we began to change our outputs, our exports, we began to become a much more powerful country. And the thing is, Jefferson did not embrace that approach at all. He was more focused on the individual and having subsidies for farmers, etc., which is fine. He's a champion of the people. But it's not necessarily what led to the growth of our country. And that's why I have Madison ahead of him, because you talked about it yourself. You have the trade embargo that he implemented, or with the Napoleonic Wars. That was a disaster. It
was. But the thing is that both solutions in that case were not that great. Okay. So the options were essentially, okay, shall we embargo France or shall we embargo England? There wasn't, or shall we just not trade at all? So I think it's like one of those things where it's easy to say in retrospect, oh, this wasn't good. But at the same time, what options did he have?
Well, that's my argument. That's my argument, is that Madison went after these people. That's why I had Madison in here. He went right into the War of 1812 and protected American foreign interests in trade internationally. Jefferson didn't have that backbone. He didn't, and he was more focused on domestic issues, which is fine. I've mentioned that, but if we were focused on growth, we needed to protect the industrialists and the expansion of trade, and that's just not something that he was able to do. That's why I had Jefferson out.
Yeah. So, Mark, I think those were some very pertinent comments regarding Madison. Yeah, I think your list is pretty solid, though. I think Lincoln. It's a bit basic, but that's okay. That's okay. I understand.
You know what, Miles? I agree. I agree with that. Lincoln is a bit basic, and especially because I think that I could have had him slide a little bit, but I didn't for a specific reason. I'll get to that in a second. I think Lincoln's basic because he didn't really do that much. It was the cabinet around him that really helped him stay afloat. And credit to him for assembling a good cabinet. I think his um
Except for his vice president Andrew Johnson, that guy was a
yeah
disaster.
okay, that was a terrible cabinet. But the
No,
but
wasn't terrible. It
the
was fine. It
minister,
was fine. It was just a vice president, right?
yeah, just vice president. But like the minister of war that he appointed, as well as the treasurer, I think did really good. Printing fiat money and managing the economic crises associated with the war was tremendously managed by Lincoln and his administration, and I don't necessarily give credit to Lincoln for that. Also, specifically because he didn't take a hard line on slavery right away. It took him a little while. Initially his position was, you Southern states, you can decide it for yourselves, and it was kind of an ambiguous position initially. And it's only once the war started ramping up and it was pretty clear that the South was going to secede that he felt like he had to take a hard line. And I'm like, my reaction to that is, well, that's kind of easy, right? You could say whatever you want because either you have two outcomes. A, you abolish slavery, you lose the war, but slavery is abolished in the North, you don't lose any supporters. Or B, you abolish slavery and then you win the war, but since you won the war, you have the moral authority and the
exactly. Mark, at the end of the day, it's classic. It's classic politician talk. It's Pete Buttigieg 101.
Oh, that's a topic for another podcast, Miles. I love my Pete Buttigieg. Anyway, yeah. So Lincoln, I had to put there, kind of basic, but he's also super important in American history. I didn't really have much of a choice, in my opinion. Now, I thought about putting FDR there, and this is where I disagree with you, Miles, because for number one, because FDR is great. The New Deal, expansion of Social Security, a bunch of really awesome liberal progressive stuff that I'm a huge fan of. But
I see where this is coming. I see where this is coming. Of course, we have to address the internment camps, right?
You can't put Japanese Americans into freaking internment camps, and not to mention like the plight of the Jews, dude. Like he didn't care. He's like I
mean, look, that's true, but I think Mark, when we're talking about this list of presidents, we have to realize that there are more bad presidents than good ones. So I think we want to do an episode on the worst presidents, but of course we just want to be positive at first, kind of not be so bitter and negative all the time. But I think it is true that most presidents, especially even the good ones that did good things, they're known for having done bad decisions. Everyone in my list, I can say a bunch of things I disagree with them. I think same thing for Mark's list. I think there are disagreements that I have with all of the people on that list.
Yeah, I agree.
And so I think in terms of the internment camp thing, I think it's absolutely terrible. It's at the same time though, I think that whether was his full decision, I think this may have been in part because of the cabinet. I think that's a big possibility. At the same time, though, I think that just his handling of the Great Depression in the time that was kind of crucial to America, I think kind of I can't say this, but like it kind of compensates itself. I mean, it was really terrible, but at the same time, he really
it's so much for the country. And that's
revitalized the economy.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Miles. It's terrible, but he did so much for the country. I couldn't put him first with that. I just couldn't.
I understand. I understand that. Yeah. But
Right,
I'm
Miles.
still putting him first.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Okay, so that's only 5 presidents. There's a lot more than 5 presidents. Do you have any people that you could have? Because I know that I had some people that had a really hard time leaving out of the top 5. But
before, sure. But before, I think because we talked about this before the show, I think that we both have, what's interesting is we both have an idea of the most underrated president. So Nixon, right? Nixon.
Yeah, which is so weird to say, right? Because we're Democrats, and we hate Nixon. We do hate Nixon. We don't like Watergate. That was kind of messed up.
Yeah,
But But at the same time, Nixon did some pretty cool stuff. I don't know if you want to go into it. I have some things that I want to say.
Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, I think the one that comes to head first of all is the EPA. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, the EPA is great. I mean,
There's-
like,
there's
what
that-
else, right?
Yeah, the creation of the EPA, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Endangered
Yeah,
Species Act.
exactly.
I mean, that's
I
awesome.
mean,
Okay,
if you just, yeah, exactly. If your presidency, like, you do nothing for 4 years, and it just consists of making of creating the EPA, I think it's a pretty successful presidency. I mean,
doesn't matter if you're
Yeah.
Republican or Democrat. I don't care. That's amazing. He's really. It's kind of unfortunate that his party removed a lot of those protections, because what he did was really impressive, and gotta appreciate Nixon for that. Also, what else did he do? He reopened diplomatic relations with China after several decades of silence. I don't know how I feel about that. It was an important step. Having diplomatic relations with China, especially nowadays, is extremely
so
important.
I think this is actually a perfect podcast topic. I think in terms of diplomatic relations with China, I think it's been overall a failure though, because the idea was at the time that because we're going to have more relations with China, we're going to have more businesses there, or, American corporations there. We're going to end up having, we're going to end up influencing them to become more liberal, liberalist and democratic. But the thing is that that hasn't happened, right? You see that it's kind of the opposite that's happening, where because it's such a huge market, these companies, they're censored, right? They can't say certain things.
Exactly.
We've seen this with there's actually a great South Park episode on it. But I mean, like Disney, for example, being like they have to like cut out certain parts of their movies, and they have to. Exactly. They're censored by a board of Chinese propagandists or whatever you call them. So
I think
I mean, I think just to finish it off, and I'll let you talk, Mark, but I think it was a good idea. I think it made sense originally, but I think that unfortunately, I think it's still mixed. It has mixed consequences because of how the initial idea behind the law really has kind of it's turned itself on its head.
I agree with that. Although I think it's a little bit too early to tell, because I think we have businesses in China that have really, I mean, I don't want to get too into this, but the privatization of China has been really helpful for the United States and for China as well. It's unfortunate that their leadership has made it so that we can't take full advantage of the situation. You're right, though. We can talk a lot about China in other episodes. I kind of want to move on, because one more thing about Nixon, though, also had some arms negotiations with Russia that were pretty important. Having the anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia, for example, maybe, kind of help start with the denuclearization conversations that they had in the coming decades, with Reagan, for example. We could talk about that in another episode. But I do want to talk about some presidents who I could have put in my top 5, but I didn't, for various reasons. For me, I think we already talked about them. I'm not going to talk about them too much. Teddy Roosevelt, JFK, I think they were in your top 5. I totally agree with them being really well positioned. I didn't put JFK in my top 5 because he didn't serve a long enough term, in my opinion. He did some important stuff with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I didn't see enough out of him, especially since I agree with you, decreasing the marginal tax rate for the 1%, not a move for me. And same thing with reducing corporate taxes, especially in a time when the economy was doing relatively well. So I wasn't a huge fan of that. I left him out of my top 5 for that.
But the thing about JFK, though, I think what's worth mentioning is that he actually had some very progressive platform ideas.
He did.
But the thing is that I think part of the reason he didn't implement it was because he was only there for 2 years, right?
Yeah,
so,
I agree with you. That's why I kept him.
I think he was for Medicare for all, right? I think it was. I was at that time where it was becoming a thing in Europe, but I think there's a clip you can see on the YouTubes, right, of him, of JFK endorsing that. So of course,
although
I have to mention that, right?
different circumstances, we hadn't fully gone into the privatization of healthcare. Anyway, topic for another time, because we love talking about healthcare. Let's see, who else did I leave out? The whole Truman, Monroe, a little bit kind of older presidents in the last 150 years. I put Monroe was interesting for me because the Monroe Doctrine was really important for United States American for our history, really, and we kind of took that principle and ran with it. But he was also a racist. Same thing
Yeah,
could be said
for
for
Thomas
Woodrow.
Jefferson. Yeah. Oh yeah,
Yeah,
especially Woodrow Wilson. That guy was a mess.
like you guys are really important for American history, and they did a lot
No,
for.
he was terrible though. He was terrible.
You know, it helps with our image. You know, like they that's what makes American great is that we've had presidents who've done some really terrible things and some really interesting things as well.
Woodrow Wilson is. I mean, look, in terms of like our foreign policy today, all the reasons it's messed up, in my opinion, is because of him. We can talk about that on our worst episode.
Yeah.
Worst
Okay.
president
Yeah.
episode, but
I
yeah,
can,
yes.
okay, that's fair. That's fair. But he's still an interesting guy, and like did a lot for America. Not necessarily in a good way, but impacted American politics for a long time. So I had to include him on worth mentioning list, if you will. Same thing for like Lyndon Johnson with the Civil Acts, right?
Yep.
And then here's my most interesting president, because no one talks about this guy. I can't even remember his name properly, but the Benjamin Harrison, like he was the grandson of the other Harrison president.
The guy that died of pneumonia. Yeah.
Yeah, like 30
After a month.
He had the Sherman Antitrust Acts. He was a terrible president, but that was really important for America, curbing the robber barons' expansion and exploitation of the American working class. So I thought he was interesting. He's not a top 10 president, but I've wanted to mention him regardless. So I don't know if you have any other presidents you want to mention before we finish this up.
I mean, personally, it's just because I think American presidents are so terrible historically. And you may see me as a pessimist, but I really don't care. You know, I think there are some, again, I think like you, there are some presidents that here and there, they had some good, they did some good things. Even Ronald Reagan, who I absolutely despise, you know, he was great on foreign policy. So like, I think that there's, you know, in terms of the best presidents,
Space Force.
Yeah, Star Wars, yeah, the Star Wars program. I think in terms, you know, like, of course, every historian is going to tell you this, but, you know, history is very complex. And I think especially with the presidents, I mean, it's a lot of like mixed, you know, it's like mixed bag for a lot of people. And, you know, I think for that reason, I mean, really also because I don't really know that many presidents in the late 19th century.
Yeah, let's be honest.
So, I'm sorry, guys. Yeah, let's be honest. So I think, yeah, that rounds up our list. Totally.
I think that was a good list, Miles. I think we did a nice job.
I had such a great time talking with Mark today. It was such an amazing conversation. So I'm also so excited to do our next, or not our next episode, but an episode, a sequel to this one, with Mark about our worst presidents. And yeah, so our podcast is produced by Tom Clare and Mark Wahab. The music is done by Louis de La Roche. I'm Miles. This is The Conversation in Exchange.